I was sitting in a cold probate office when my mother-in-law, Diane Whitmore, leaned forward and declared that my late father's entire inheritance now belonged to her family because I was legally absorbed into theirs through marriage. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. The room smelled of old paper and indifference. I looked toward the clerk, hoping for a sign of correction, but he avoided eye contact, shuffling papers with shaking fingers. My mother-in-law's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence with a cold sense of entitlement. She acted as though my father's life work was merely a supplement to her own family's coffers. Then the door opened and a probate lawyer in a charcoal suit stepped in, Attorney Caleb Mercer. He moved with a quiet, practiced authority that made the temperature in the room feel even lower. He placed a sealed black envelope on the table and said, "Before anything is transferred, we need to discuss the trust your father never publicly registered." Diane scoffed, crossing her arms tightly, but I saw her hand tremble as it rested on the mahogany desk. The air suddenly felt charged with a power I didn't know I possessed. I realized this was not just a legal meeting, it was a battle. Diane immediately pushed a stack of documents toward me, demanding I sign over estate control, to avoid complications. Her eyes were cold, scanning my face for any sign of resistance. She spoke with a rehearsed fluidity that told me she had practiced this moment in the mirror. My husband, Ryan Whitmore, leaned in close, his voice a low, frantic whisper in my ear. "Just sign them, Elena," he urged. "Resisting will only make things worse. Don't cause a scene in front of the lawyer." His betrayal stung worse than his mother's greed. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at the exit, terrified of his mother's disapproval. I felt the paper under my fingertips, the ink fresh and intimidating. Caleb Mercer interrupted the moment, his voice calm but authoritative. He warned that any form of coercion effectively invalidated any claim Diane was attempting to push through today. The room suddenly felt like a trap closing in on me. The walls seemed to move an inch closer, the fluorescent lights humming with a low, aggressive intensity. Diane's jaw set, her confidence wavering for a fraction of a second as she looked at Caleb. I held my breath, realizing the fight for my father's legacy had officially begun. Ryan refused to meet my eyes as Diane spoke over me as if I were not even present. She discussed my father's assets like a predator listing the features of its prey. It was degrading to be reduced to a bystander in my own grief. I realized with a sickening clarity that no one in his family was on my side. I had walked into this office believing in the sanctity of family, only to find a vacuum where loyalty should have been. I sat stiffly in my chair, listening to the drone of their demands. Suddenly, I felt a slight movement beside me. Caleb Mercer had leaned in, his gaze fixed on his laptop. He quietly slid a small, folded note toward my side of the table. I moved my hand to cover it, then glanced down as he leaned back. "Do not sign anything," the note read in crisp, firm handwriting. "Your father anticipated pressure like this." A wave of relief washed over me. I wasn't alone in this room after all. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to unwind. I had a secret ally, and he was ready to speak for me. Caleb asked when Diane first had access to my father's estate files. I remembered her insisting I bring her copies, for safekeeping, weeks before my father died. At the time, I thought she was trying to be helpful during my time of exhaustion and mourning. Now, the memory felt like a dagger in my back. My stomach dropped. She may have been planning this all along, waiting for the exact moment of my vulnerability to strike. The sheer malice behind her kindness was staggering. I looked at her, and she was watching me with an expectant, predatory stare. She had played the part of the concerned mother-in-law perfectly, all while calculating exactly how to strip me of my father's hard-earned life savings. The weight of her deception felt like a physical burden. I wondered how many other times I had been duped by her soft-spoken demands. It was clear that her concern had always been a mask for her hunger. I felt my resolve harden. The guilt I had been carrying for not being grateful enough toward her evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, sharp need for the truth. The probate office cannot locate the original full estate file. The clerk spent 20 minutes searching, his brow furrowed, eventually claiming the digital link had been corrupted. Diane appeared too calm, sitting perfectly still with her hands folded, like she knew exactly where it was. Caleb's expression tightened. He looked at the clerk, then at Diane, his eyes narrowing. "That is highly irregular," he remarked, his voice icy. Something was deeply wrong. I realized that Diane hadn't just come here to argue, she had come prepared to rewrite the history of my father's holdings. If the original file was missing, it left a void that she could fill with her own manufactured narratives. I felt a surge of panic, but I looked at Caleb, who was already typing away, his fingers flying across the keys. He was documenting every inconsistency. Diane was making a mistake by being so confident. She had underestimated the reach of a man like Caleb Mercer. I held on to the edge of my seat, realizing that the missing file was actually the first piece of evidence in proving her illegal interference. Caleb reveals my father left behind confidential instructions stating a secondary trust exists, to be revealed only if any party attempted manipulation or unauthorized control. The room went deathly quiet. Diane abruptly demanded the hearing be stopped, her face flushing a deep, mottled red. "This is preposterous," she snapped, standing up. "I will not sit here and be accused of such nonsense." But Caleb didn't move. He simply reached into his briefcase and produced a second document, its seal intact and official. He explained that my father, knowing the character of the people around me, had built a fail-safe into his estate planning. He had protected me from beyond the grave. My heart swelled with gratitude. He knew. He had seen Diane's ambition for what it was and had taken steps to ensure she could never touch what was rightfully mine. Diane's attempt to end the hearing only proved how desperate she was to keep the secondary trust hidden. Her outburst had stripped away her facade of composure, revealing the frantic, greedy woman beneath. She was terrified of what was about to come out. Ryan admits his mother has always controlled the Whitmore family finances. "That's just how she is," he says weakly, his voice barely audible. We were sitting in the hallway during a short recess, the cold tiles beneath us adding to the chill in my heart. He looked broken, a man who had finally realized the shadow his mother cast over his entire existence. For the first time, I could hear the doubt in his voice, the sound of a man questioning his own reality. He had spent his entire life accommodating her needs, believing it was normal for a mother to demand such absolute obedience. I looked at him with a mixture of pity and frustration. He was a grown man, yet he was still living under her thumb. "She isn't how she is, Ryan," I said firmly. "She is a bully, and you have been letting her bully us." He didn't argue. He just stared at the floor, his shoulders hunched. The veil was slipping, and he was starting to see the truth. It was a painful transformation, but it was absolutely necessary for our future. Diane attempts to initiate a transfer from the estate account, but the transaction is immediately frozen by the bank's security system. A red light flashed on the clerk's terminal, a harsh, mechanical sound that echoed in the quiet office. Caleb confirms, someone else already placed a legal lock on the funds. Diane's face went pale, her composure finally shattered. She stared at the screen as if she could force it to change through sheer willpower alone. I felt a surge of pure triumph. She had expected to walk in, dictate the terms, and walk out with my father's legacy, but she had hit a wall she couldn't move. She turned to look at me, her eyes filled with raw, unadulterated hatred. She realized she had been outmaneuvered. I sat back, watching her unravel. It was the first time I had ever seen her look truly defeated. The lock on the funds was more than just a legal procedure, it was a symbol of the control she had finally lost. I was not going to let her win today. Caleb uncovers a second ledger tied to my father's holdings under an encrypted code name. The value listed is far higher than the inheritance Diane is fighting over. It appeared my father had been much more successful than even I had realized, carefully building a fortune that he kept entirely separate from his primary accounts. The numbers on the screen were astronomical, a testament to his life of quiet, steady work. Diane was fighting over the crumbs, unaware that the real feast was tucked away in a place she couldn't reach. I felt a sense of awe. My father had been a strategist, a man who built a future for me that was shielded from the greed of people like Diane. She had been so focused on taking what was on the surface that she failed to see the foundation underneath. As Caleb explained the value of the holdings, Diane looked as though she had been struck. She was losing everything, not just the inheritance, but the chance to claim the power she had spent years coveting. We located a safe deposit box registered under my father's name at a secure bank downtown. Diane claims she holds access, pulling out a key she insisted she had been given years ago. Caleb states only the true beneficiary can open it, according to the trust documents. The bank manager approached, checking the paperwork and comparing our signatures against the records in the file. Diane looked ready to explode, her presence in the bank lobby drawing stares from the other customers. She was being treated like a stranger because that was exactly what she was. I walked toward the vault, the air inside feeling sterile and heavy. Diane stood back, her hands balled into tight fists, watching me with a look of pure, unadulterated malice. She had been so sure that she could force her way into the final piece of the puzzle, but the law had stopped her cold. The box was waiting, and I had the authority to see what my father had left me. The tension was reaching a breaking point. Inside the box, I find a sealed handwritten letter. My hands shake as I read, "If you are seeing this, someone has already tried to take what I left you." The words were his, steady and strong, written in the ink of a man who loved me more than he cared about wealth. He had known, he had understood, and he had prepared for this exact scenario. He had been one step ahead of Diane for years. I read the letter twice, tears blurring the lines of his familiar script. He had apologized for the conflict I was now facing, but he had given me the tools to fight it. It wasn't just a letter, it was his final act of protection. He told me to trust Caleb and to stand my ground, no matter what Diane promised or threatened. I folded the letter and put it in my bag, feeling a deep, abiding connection to him. He was gone, but his spirit was here, fighting by my side. Diane was standing outside the vault, but she was already losing the battle. Caleb finally confirms it, a hidden trust exists in my name, but it is sealed pending court verification. The bank manager stepped back, giving us room as Caleb officially recorded the existence of the trust. Diane's confidence cracks for the first time, her face sagging with the weight of the realization. She had staked her entire reputation on her ability to manipulate me and the courts, and she had failed. She knew that once a court was involved, the scrutiny would be intense. Her secret history, her past disputes, and her attempts to control me would all be laid bare for the judge to see. She turned and walked toward the exit, her gait less certain, her posture less rigid. I watched her go, a sense of immense clarity washing over me. She had come to destroy me, but she had only succeeded in digging her own grave. The battle wasn't over, but the tides had shifted. I had the trust, the law, and the memory of my father on my side. A court investigator reveals Diane has been involved in multiple estate disputes in the past. Similar patterns. Similar, family entitlement, claims. She had made a habit of swooping in on grieving families, masquerading as a helpful relative while systematically stripping them of their assets. It was a career of predation. She had been sued before, but she had always managed to settle out of court, using her wealth to buy the silence of her victims. This time, however, she had targeted the wrong person. The investigator provided us with a list of her past victims, a map of her greed that proved she wasn't just an overbearing mother-in-law, she was a serial manipulator. I felt sickened, but also empowered. The truth was building into a mountain that she could not climb. The pattern of her behavior was undeniable, and the court was now viewing her through a completely different lens. She was no longer a grieving mother-in-law, she was a defendant who was finally going to be held accountable for her actions. Ryan confronts his mother quietly after the hearing. Their conversation becomes heated in the hallway, the sound of her voice rising in indignation. He starts realizing she has never been fully honest with him about anything. He asked her about the other disputes, about the secret bank accounts, and about why she was so obsessed with my inheritance. Her responses were the same old lies, but they didn't work on him anymore. I heard him say, "You didn't care about the family, Mom. You just wanted the money." It was a moment of profound heartbreak for him, but it was also the moment he finally began to separate himself from her control. He walked away from her, coming to stand next to me. He wasn't the strong leader I had once imagined, but he was a man who was finally looking at the world with his own eyes. The realization that his mother was the architect of his unhappiness was the first step toward his own liberation. Caleb explains the trust activates automatically if any coercion or financial manipulation is proven after my father's death. This was the trap my father had set, a legal trigger that would snap shut the moment she made her move. Diane suddenly goes silent. She realized that everything she had done, the demands, the fake documents, the pressure on Ryan, had only served to trigger the very mechanism that would seal her out. It was poetic justice of the highest order. Every action she took to take control had actually made it impossible for her to get it. She stood there, frozen, the reality of her own stupidity dawning on her. Caleb wasn't just her lawyer, he was the executor of my father's master plan. The trap was sprung, and Diane was right in the middle of it. She couldn't argue her way out of the legal clauses that my father had carefully drafted. The law was now operating on his terms, not hers. I felt a surge of respect for the man he was. Messages surfaced showing Diane pressured me into estate discussions shortly before my father died. Legally, it qualifies as manipulation. We had the texts, the emails, and the voice messages, all clearly documenting her attempts to rush me into signing away my rights while my father was still on his deathbed. It was a cold-blooded attempt to exploit my grief. When the judge read the transcripts, he didn't even look at Diane. He didn't have to. The evidence was damning. It spoke of a woman who didn't care about anything but the bank account balance. I watched her as the judge cited the messages, her face turning pale. She had thought she was being clever, using her influence to bypass the law, but she had left a trail that made her guilt crystal clear. I had kept every single one of those messages, and they were now the proof that would ensure she never had a say in my life again. Diane hires a powerful attorney and claims I fabricated everything to steal control of the estate. She paints me as unstable and opportunistic, trying to use the court to keep me away from my father's legacy. It was a pathetic attempt to flip the script, but no one was buying it. Her lawyer was aggressive, barking questions and trying to make me look like the aggressor, but he didn't have the facts on his side. He only had her lies. Every time he tried to push a theory, Caleb was there with the evidence to shut it down. I sat in the witness stand, my hands steady, answering each question with the simple, boring truth. She looked more desperate with every passing minute. She had lost the ability to control the story, and the desperation made her look even more guilty. She was trying to play the victim, but the facts were a shield that her attorney couldn't pierce. I was going to see this through to the end. In court, Diane confidently argues she is the rightful family authority, standing before the judge as if she were giving a lecture. She spoke of traditions and family duties, weaving a web of false narrative that she had used to dominate everyone around her. Then Caleb arrives, carrying the sealed envelope my father left behind. He walked to the center of the courtroom, his presence immediately silencing the room. He didn't need to shout, he just had to present the documents. The judge looked at him, then at Diane, and signaled for the trial to proceed. Diane looked at the envelope and her composure began to break. She knew what was inside. She knew that her version of the truth was about to be obliterated by the actual truth. I stood up, feeling a wave of calm wash over me. The charade was almost over. The court was about to see the real Diane Whitmore, and she would have nowhere left to hide. The judge allows the sealed trust envelope to be opened under court supervision. Diane's face drains of color, her skin turning an ashen gray. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She looked small, stripped of the false power she had brandished for years. I leaned forward, my heart hammering in my chest. This was it. The moment of truth. Caleb cut the seal, the sound of the paper tearing sounding like a thunderclap in the silent courtroom. He removed the contents, laying them out on the judge's desk. The judge began to read, his eyes moving slowly across the pages. Diane wouldn't look at him. She stared straight ahead, a frozen expression on her face. She was already living in the aftermath of her own destruction. She had built her life on a foundation of sand, and now the tide had finally come in. I felt a sense of release that was almost overwhelming. Ryan finally realizes his entire life has been shaped by his mother's control. He steps away from her side for the first time, standing apart from her in the courtroom. It was a powerful image, the sun moving away from the darkness that had defined his world. He looked at me, and I saw a man who was finally breathing on his own. He realized that the woman he called Mom had never truly loved him as an individual, he was just another instrument for her ambition. He looked at her, then back at me, his eyes filled with a new kind of clarity. He didn't say a word, but the message was clear. He was choosing the truth, even if it meant losing the family he had always known. The emotional severance was painful, but it was necessary. He was reclaiming his own humanity, stepping out of the shadow that had been cast by his mother's greed. Caleb opens the envelope. Inside are financial audits, my father's recorded instructions, and a legal declaration naming me as sole protected beneficiary. Caleb read each document into the record, his voice clear and resonant. The instructions were specific, detailing exactly how the estate was to be handled and explicitly barring Diane from any access. It was a complete and total victory. My father had left nothing to chance. He had anticipated every move she might make, and he had checkmated her. As the documents were read, I could see the jurors nodding, understanding the gravity of what had happened. Diane was looking at the ground, a defeated woman in a designer suit. She had tried to take everything, but she had ended up losing the only thing that actually mattered, her dignity. The truth had finally come to light, and it was devastatingly clear. I had won, not through manipulation, but through the simple power of the truth. The courtroom erupts into silence as Diane's claims are dismantled line by line. The judge orders a full estate freeze pending investigation. The silence was heavy, filled with the weight of her disgrace. She sat still, her face a mask of shock. The judge told the bailiff to assist her in leaving the court, as her presence was no longer requested. She was being treated like the intruder she was. I watched her go, a sense of relief washing over me. She would not be coming back. The estate was safe, the truth was out, and I had been exonerated. I looked at Caleb, who was packing his briefcase with a satisfied smile. He had done his job perfectly. I stood up, feeling like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The process had been long and exhausting, but it was worth it. I had saved my father's legacy, and I had finally taken back control of my own life. Evidence reveals Diane attempted to redirect estate funds into private accounts under her control. The court orders an immediate forensic audit. This was the final nail. The investigation into her previous disputes was expanding, and it was clear that she was going to be dealing with the legal system for a very long time. Her bank accounts were being audited, her past transactions were being reviewed, and the full extent of her fraud was being exposed. It was a thorough and systematic dismantling of her empire of lies. She was not just losing the estate, she was losing everything. Her reputation was in tatters, and her legal future looked incredibly grim. I watched as the investigators began their work, a sense of calm prevailing. She had tried to ruin me, but she had only succeeded in ruining herself. The justice system was working, and it was working exactly the way it was meant to. Diane loses legal authority over everything. Her reputation collapses. Ryan cuts ties with her emotionally, realizing the extent of the deception. The news of her downfall spread quickly, and the people she had once intimidated were now coming forward to talk to the authorities. She was alone, isolated, and facing a future that would be defined by her own misdeeds. I saw a report about her on the local news, her face plastered across the screen as an example of estate fraud. It was a public ending to a private tragedy. Ryan didn't even watch it. He was busy working on our own future, a life that was being built without the interference of his mother. We had both been victims of her greed, but we were both moving on. She had lost her power, her family, and her future, all because she couldn't stop reaching for what wasn't hers. Months later, the trust is fully released to me. I use part of it to establish a foundation in my father's name, dedicated to helping families avoid the kind of predation Diane had practiced. Ryan and I rebuild slowly, but this time without interference. We bought a small, quiet house where we could focus on our own growth. At a quiet family gathering, I realized the inheritance was never just money, it was my father's final protection against control disguised as family. I sat in our living room, the sunlight streaming through the windows, and felt a sense of peace I had never known. The battles of the past were fading, and the promise of the future was unfolding. I had been tested, but I had come out of it stronger and more certain of who I was. I had honored my father's memory, protected his legacy, and, most importantly, I had protected myself. I was finally, truly, free. The inheritance was the beginning, but the truth was the reward.